The winter of 1945 hung over northern Germany like a shroud of exhaustion. The war had nearly burned itself out, but its dying embers still scorched everything they touched. Roads were choked with refugees, their belongings piled upon carts, their faces hollow from hunger. Allied tanks rolled through the villages that had once sung the songs of the Reich, and silence followed in their wake, an uneasy, watching silence. Among the advancing forces was Captain Thomas Harland of the British Army, a man of discipline and resolve. At 35, he had seen too many bodies, too many villages reduced to rubble, too many children's eyes staring blankly through the smoke. Duty had carried him across Africa, Italy, and now into the heart of a defeated Germany. His orders were clear: maintain order, detain German soldiers, and keep the peace until the surrender became complete. But peace, as Harland was beginning to understand, was more complicated than victory. One morning, as a pale sun struggled to rise over a town called Lüneburg, Harland walked through the marketplace, or what remained of it. Burned stalls, broken glass, the smell of old ash and despair. And there, beneath a shattered awning, lay a child, a boy of perhaps 8 years, filthy, skeletal, clutching an empty tin cup. His hair was matted, his lips blue. When Harland crouched beside him, the boy flinched, expecting a blow. "Are you alone?" Harland asked softly. The child did not answer. His eyes darted toward the officer's pistol, then toward the distant sound of engines. In that moment, something inside Harland shifted. He saw not the enemy, not a remnant of the Reich, but a child of Europe, broken, starving, and entirely alone. Yet he knew the truth. British officers were forbidden from aiding German civilians directly. Supplies were rationed for the army and for displaced persons under supervision. To help this boy would be to violate regulations, to invite punishment. But as Harland watched the boy's trembling fingers, the thought of walking away seemed more unthinkable than any court-martial. He reached into his pack, drew out a single tin of army rations, and pressed it into the boy's hands. The child stared, uncertain, as if kindness itself were a foreign language. The war was not yet over, but for Captain Thomas Harland, something had just begun. That night, Harland lay awake in his billet, the image of the boy haunting him. He had done what was forbidden, what the military police would call fraternization with the enemy. Yet all he could think about was whether the child had survived the cold. The next morning, as snow drifted through the streets, Harland returned to the same ruined square. The boy was still there, sitting in the shadow of a collapsed wall, clutching the empty ration tin. When he saw Harland, he stood weakly, as though unsure whether to run or salute. Harland knelt again. "What is your name?" he asked. After a pause, the boy whispered, "Emil." He was thin as a reed, with eyes too large for his face. His parents, Harland learned through broken German and gesture, had died in the last bombing raid. He had been scavenging alone for weeks. The officer looked around. British patrols were beginning to move through the district. If he were seen giving food again, questions would follow. He should have walked away. But instead, Harland motioned for the boy to follow him. He led Emil to a small stable behind the billet, a forgotten space where hay still lingered from before the war. "Stay here," Harland said, quietly. "I will bring food." Emil nodded, eyes wide with both fear and gratitude. That single decision, an act of mercy born in silence, would mark the rest of Harland's life. It was a line crossed not in anger, but in compassion. Yet in that war, compassion could be a dangerous thing. As Harland closed the stable door, the sound of boots echoed nearby. Voices called his name. He straightened his uniform, forcing calm. The real battle, he knew, had only just begun. The British occupation of northern Germany in 1945 was a time of both triumph and torment. The Third Reich had collapsed in ruins, its cities flattened, its armies shattered. But with victory came responsibility, the responsibility to restore order in a land that had been starved by its own leaders and battered by months of Allied bombardment. In the first months after Germany's surrender, millions of civilians wandered the roads. Refugees from the east fled the Red Army, former prisoners stumbled back from concentration camps, and families searched in vain for those who would never return. The Allied soldiers who entered these territories faced a strange and difficult role. Conquerors, liberators, and caretakers all at once. For the British Army, strict rules governed every interaction with German civilians. Soldiers were forbidden to share food or supplies except through official relief channels. Any breach of these rules was considered a disciplinary offense, punishable by demotion, imprisonment, or court-martial. The fear was not merely that aid might be exploited by remnants of the Nazi regime, but that sympathy might erode the moral barrier between victor and vanquished. Captain Thomas Harland was a product of these regulations. A career officer who had joined the British Army before the war, he believed in discipline and hierarchy. Yet as the war's final winter turned to spring, he found himself stationed among ruins that blurred the very lines those rules were meant to protect. His unit, part of the British Second Army, had been tasked with overseeing the disarmament of German troops and maintaining order among civilians. Food shortages were severe. Children begged in the streets. Disease spread through overcrowded shelters. Even seasoned soldiers found their resolve tested by the sight of so many broken lives. For Harland, the dilemma was personal. He had once prided himself on being a man of duty, but duty had always meant protecting the weak, defending the innocent. Now, that very principle seemed in conflict with his orders. In letters to his wife back in Kent, which he never sent, Harland wrote of his unease. He described the hollow faces of the children, the eerie quiet after the surrender, the strange feeling that victory had somehow lost its meaning. He wrote, "I do not know if we have won anything at all. The flags are ours, the roads are ours, but the hearts, those remain buried under rubble. Perhaps we have liberated a land only to inherit its ghosts." Those ghosts lingered in every street he patrolled, and among them was one child, a small boy named Emil, whose hunger would test the boundaries of one man's conscience and one army's law. Each day in Lüneburg unfolded with mechanical precision. At dawn, British patrols checked the checkpoints, inspecting papers, confiscating weapons. By mid-morning, convoys from Hamburg brought limited rations for distribution among displaced persons and prisoners. The town's remaining German police worked under British supervision, their uniforms stripped of insignia. Captain Harland moved through these routines with quiet efficiency, concealing the turmoil that brewed within him. Each night, after the officers' mess dispersed, he would slip through the alleyways to the old stable, carrying a small parcel wrapped in cloth. Inside were scraps of bread, potatoes, and occasionally a bit of tinned meat saved from his rations. Emil would be waiting in the hay, silent but alert. He no longer flinched at Harland's presence. Instead, he watched him with cautious trust. Sometimes Harland would speak softly, teaching him English words: bread, water, friend. Emil repeated them with effort, his accent thick but determined. For a time, this fragile secret life gave Harland purpose. Amid the discipline of occupation, he had found a reason to act beyond orders. But secrecy in wartime was a fragile thing. One evening, Lieutenant Howard, a younger officer known for his devotion to procedure, spotted Harland returning late. "Out walking again, Captain?" he asked with a hint of suspicion. Harland smiled evenly. "Old habits. I like to see the town quiet before I rest." Howard's gaze lingered. "You know the regulations. No fraternization. The locals must see us as authority, not charity." "Quite right," Harland replied, though the words felt heavy in his mouth. That night, he sat beside Emil in the dark stable and listened to the boy's breathing. "If they find you here, it will be difficult," Harland said. Emil looked up, puzzled. "Difficult? It means trouble. For both of us." The boy frowned, then nodded slowly, understanding more from Harland's tone than the words themselves. Days became weeks. Spring arrived, thawing the frozen fields and bringing with it rumors of demobilization. Soldiers longed to go home. Yet for Harland, the thought of leaving Germany filled him with dread. Who would care for Emil then? He began making inquiries in secret, asking the chaplain about orphanages, the Red Cross liaison about displaced children. Most facilities were overwhelmed, filled with orphans from across Europe. "German children are the last to be placed," the chaplain admitted quietly. "There is too much bitterness still." One afternoon, as Harland returned from a supply inspection, he found 2 military police officers waiting near the stable. They were searching the premises for contraband and unauthorized civilians. His pulse quickened. Inside, Emil hid beneath the hay as Harland entered, his boots crunching softly. "Stay silent," he whispered. The officers checked storage crates, glanced at the walls, then left without further inspection. Harland exhaled, his composure cracking only when he was alone again. It was then that he realized how far he had gone. He was no longer merely feeding a child. He was defying his command, endangering his rank, and risking imprisonment. Yet he could not bring himself to regret it. For amid the ruins of conquest, he had found something that war had tried to erase: the simple, stubborn persistence of human decency. The change in Harland was gradual, but unmistakable. His fellow officers noticed he spoke less in the mess, that he seemed withdrawn, almost haunted. They assumed fatigue or disillusionment. None guessed that each night, their commanding officer shared his bread with a German child. In the stable, Emil's health began to recover. His cheeks filled out, his eyes regained a spark of life. He began to smile, an uncertain, fragile thing that reminded Harland of his own son back home. But with each passing day, the danger grew. Rumors spread among the ranks of officers punished for minor infractions, such as trading cigarettes with locals, sheltering civilians, or sharing food. A single accusation could end a career. Harland wrestled with the fear constantly. The part of him that had been trained to obey recoiled at what he was doing. Yet another part, quieter but stronger, whispered that obedience without compassion was not duty but surrender. One evening, as the sun bled red across the ruined rooftops, Emil asked, "Why do you help me?" Harland hesitated. "Because you are a child," he said finally. "Because no one should be left to starve." The boy tilted his head. "My father said the English are cruel." "Perhaps we are," Harland murmured, "but not today." In that simple exchange, something shifted within him. The wall that war had built between enemy and ally crumbled. Emil was no longer German. He was simply human. When Harland later learned that his battalion would soon be reassigned to Hanover, panic set in. He could not take Emil with him. He could not leave him either. For the first time since the war began, he prayed. Not for victory, but for guidance. He found it, unexpectedly, in the chaplain. When Harland confessed the truth, the priest listened in silence, then said, "The letter of the law serves order, but mercy serves the soul. You must choose which you can live with." That night, Harland made his decision. On the eve of departure, Harland arranged false papers identifying Emil as a displaced Polish orphan, a desperate act that could have cost him everything. He secured the help of a local Red Cross worker, a widow who had lost her own son. Together, they dressed Emil in clean clothes and prepared him for transfer to a nearby children's shelter. At dawn, military police units inspected the convoy. Harland stood by the truck, his heart pounding. Emil sat among a group of children, silent, clutching a wool blanket. An officer approached. "Captain Harland, are these all registered evacuees?" Harland met his gaze evenly. "They are," he said. His voice did not waver. The officer glanced over the papers, nodded, and signaled the convoy forward. As the trucks rolled out, Harland watched Emil disappear down the road, his small hand lifting in farewell. For a moment, the burden of war lifted from Harland's shoulders. He had disobeyed, deceived, and risked disgrace, but he had saved a life. Hours later, the battalion departed for Hanover. In his dispatches, Harland wrote nothing of the boy, nothing of the stable, nothing of the nights spent breaking bread in silence. The war had ended, but his own reckoning had only begun. When Captain Thomas Harland returned to England in late 1945, the streets were bright with flags and victory banners. Yet to him, the celebration felt hollow. His wife embraced him. His son stared in awe at the uniform, but behind his smile lingered a shadow. In the months that followed, he resumed civilian life, taking a modest post with the Ministry of Agriculture. To most, he was a man restored to peace. But inside, the memories of Lüneburg persisted. The starving faces, the ruined streets, and one boy's quiet gratitude. Occasionally, Harland dreamed of Emil. In his mind, the child grew older, stronger, running through a field of spring grass. He wondered if the boy ever remembered him, if the small act of mercy had endured amid the chaos of rebuilding Germany. Years passed. Europe rebuilt itself upon the ashes of its own destruction. The British occupation ended, and Germany rose again from ruin. Harland grew older, his medals gathering dust in a drawer. Then, in 1958, a letter arrived. It bore a German stamp and a name he had not spoken aloud in over a decade. Emil Bauer. The letter was brief but heartfelt. It spoke of gratitude, of survival, of a life rebuilt. Emil had been taken in by a Polish family, educated, and had become a teacher in Bremen. "I remember the British officer who saved me," the letter read. "He taught me that mercy is not weakness but courage. I hope one day to thank you in person." Harland read it twice, then a third time, his hands trembling. For years he had questioned whether his defiance had been folly. Now, at last, he knew. That spring, Harland traveled quietly to Germany. The cities were no longer ruins, but alive with color and renewal. In a small schoolhouse near Bremen, he found Emil, no longer the frightened boy in rags, but a young man with kind eyes and a steady voice. They embraced without words. The years between them dissolved. For a long while, they simply stood in silence, two survivors of the same war, bound not by nationality or rank, but by humanity. Epilogue, moral reflection. 400 words. History often remembers victories, battles, and the movements of armies, but sometimes it is a single act of quiet defiance that defines the true measure of courage. Captain Thomas Harland's story was never written in official reports. There were no medals, no commendations. Yet his decision to save one starving child in a time of vengeance spoke more powerfully than any uniformed order. In a war that demanded obedience, he chose compassion. In a landscape of hatred, he chose mercy. And in that choice, he preserved not only a life, but the very essence of what civilization was meant to protect. Years later, when Harland passed away, that same letter from Emil was found among his few treasured possessions. On its back, in his careful handwriting, were the words, "The war taught me many things, but it was the kindness I was forbidden to give that saved me." In the end, the story of Captain Harland is not merely about war or disobedience. It is about the fragile humanity that survives beneath the weight of uniform and command. It reminds us that even in humanity's darkest hours, the smallest act of grace can endure longer than any victory, and so, somewhere between the ashes of defeat and the dawn of peace, a British officer risked everything, not for glory, not for duty, but for the quiet salvation of a single starving child.